One evening, I noticed that my wife walked in the door with a look that was slightly off. She wasn't her usual cheerful self, but she wasn't visibly upset either. It was something in between, subtle enough to catch my attention. She put her bag down on the counter, exhaled loudly, and went straight to the fridge. It wasn't the kind of sigh you make after a long day, it felt more like she was processing something. I decided not to let it slide. Sitting at the kitchen table, I asked her directly, "What's going on? Something happened at work?" I've always been a straightforward guy, and I wasn't about to start dancing around the issue now. She paused for a second, took a sip of water, and turned to face me. "You know," she started, "my colleagues are all so interesting." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "They all have these amazing hobbies. One of them plays tennis every weekend, another's into golf, and there's this one woman who's incredible at pottery. They're always talking about their hobbies during lunch breaks, sharing stories and tips. It's like they have these whole other lives outside of work." Her tone was somewhere between admiration and frustration, and I could tell this had been on her mind for a while. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "And?" I prompted. It wasn't like her to care much about what others were doing, so I figured there was more to this. She sighed again and sat down across from me. "I mean, I'm fine at work. I get along with everyone, and I'm part of the group, but," she trailed off, looking at her hands. Then, almost like she was admitting something to herself for the first time, she said, "I just feel like I'm not as interesting. I want something of my own, something unique. Not just for them but for me. I want to feel alive, like I'm not just working and coming home. You get what I'm saying?" Now, I'm not the type to get caught up in feelings or flowery ideas about self-discovery. To me, life's pretty straightforward: you find what works, you stick to it, and you move on. But I could tell this was important to her. So, I nodded and said, "All right. What kind of thing are we talking about here? You want to take up tennis, too?" I wasn't trying to be dismissive, but I'm a practical guy. If you've got a problem, you find the simplest solution. She shook her head quickly. "No, that's just it. I don't want to do what they're doing. I don't want tennis or golf or pottery. I want something that's mine, something different. Something that makes me stand out but feels like me." She looked at me expectantly, like I might have the answer. "All right," I said, leaning forward. "So you want something unique, something not already taken by your coworkers, and something you'll actually enjoy doing. That's the gist of it?" "Exactly." She seemed relieved that I understood, even if I didn't exactly share her enthusiasm. I rubbed my chin, thinking it over. "You know," I said after a moment, "all these stories about hobbies and being interesting. They don't start with someone already knowing what they want. They start with someone who's bored or feels like something's missing." I wasn't trying to be profound, it was just an observation. "All right," I finally said, "we'll figure something out. Let's find you something to do." After my wife's confession about wanting her own unique hobby, I took it as my mission to help her find something that clicked. I'm not one to back down from a problem, so I started asking around. During breaks at work, I'd casually bring it up with my coworkers. "Hey, what do your wives or girlfriends do for fun?" I'd ask, keeping it light. The responses were varied: yoga, painting classes, gardening. I even got some unexpected answers like archery and salsa dancing. I made mental notes of anything that seemed worth mentioning to her later. It felt like building a list of potential solutions. Back at home, I sat down with her one evening and showed her the list I'd compiled. She looked intrigued and even excited at some of the ideas. "Archery? That sounds cool," she said, her eyes lighting up. We found a local range and signed her up for a beginner's class. At first, she loved it. She'd come home talking about how satisfying it was to hit the target, how focused it made her feel. But after a few weeks, she started coming home quieter. When I asked about it, she shrugged and said, "It's all right, but it's just not what I'm looking for." Next, we tried a pottery class. I figured it was worth a shot since she'd mentioned her coworker who loved it. The first couple of sessions went well. She'd come home with clay on her hands and a big grin on her face. She even showed me a small bowl she'd made, proud of her work. But then, the novelty seemed to wear off. One night, she came home frustrated, muttering about how her hands always hurt and how all we ever make are bowls. I asked if she wanted to keep going, and she just shook her head. "It's not it," she said simply. I kept brainstorming. One of my coworkers' wives was into gardening, so I suggested we try that. We bought a few pots, soil, and seeds. For a while, she seemed to enjoy it. She'd spend afternoons on the balcony, planting and watering. She even got excited when the first sprouts appeared. But then, a couple of weeks later, she came back inside after watering the plants and said, "This is just slow. I don't think I'm a gardening person." She sounded disappointed, but I knew better than to push. Someone else suggested cooking classes. It wasn't exactly unique, but I figured it was worth a try. We found a local course that focused on international cuisines, and she signed up. At first, it was great. She'd come home with recipes and leftovers, excited to show me what she'd learned. I thought we'd finally found the one. But after a month, she came home and said, "It's just cooking. I already know how to cook. I don't need a class to tell me that." I even suggested something a bit more adventurous, rock climbing. It seemed different enough to grab her attention. She tried it once and came back with a mix of excitement and exhaustion. "It's fun," she said, "but I don't think I'd want to do it regularly. It's just too much effort." That one was disappointing because I thought it might stick. But I wasn't about to argue. Then there was the book club. I heard about it from a neighbor, and it seemed like a low-pressure, social activity. She gave it a shot, but after the first meeting, she told me, "It's just a bunch of people sitting around talking about books I don't even like. I'm not doing that again." After that, she tried painting. I thought this one might work because she'd always liked doodling when we were younger. We bought her some supplies, and she spent a few evenings experimenting. She seemed happy at first, but then one night, she sighed and said, "I'm just not any good at this. It's frustrating more than it's fun." Finally, I suggested photography. It was flexible, creative, and something she could do on her own time. We borrowed a camera from a friend, and she spent a couple of weekends taking pictures around the city. She seemed to enjoy it initially, but soon, she lost interest. "It's just not what I'm looking for," she said, her tone a mix of resignation and determination. No matter what we tried, nothing seemed to stick. Each time, she'd start off excited, but within weeks, she'd lose interest or find a reason it wasn't right. She looked at me one evening after we'd crossed yet another hobby off the list and said, "It's just not it." I'll be honest, hobbies were never my thing. I've always been a guy who found joy in straightforward activities. Gaming with friends after work, hanging out at the local bar on weekends, and catching up over a couple of beers, that was more than enough for me. I've never felt the need to impress anyone or prove that I'm interesting. Life's simple pleasures have always worked for me. So when my wife started her quest for a unique hobby, it was uncharted territory for me. I helped because I wanted to, but it wasn't something I could naturally relate to. One evening, after a particularly long day, I was scrolling through TikTok while unwinding. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just killing time before bed. Then, out of nowhere, this video popped up. A woman was galloping across a field on a sleek black horse, the song, "Be My Lover," blasting in the background. The whole thing was dramatic, almost cinematic. I watched it twice, then leaned back and thought, you know what? This might actually be something. At first, I hesitated to bring it up to my wife. I'm not exactly the type to suggest horseback riding, let alone because of a TikTok video. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like a solid idea. It was different from anything her coworkers were doing. It had a sense of elegance and freedom to it. And it was definitely unique. So, the next evening, I brought it up. "Hey," I said casually, "have you ever thought about horseback riding?" Her reaction was instant and electric. She practically jumped off the couch. "Horseback riding," she repeated, her eyes lighting up. "That's it. That's exactly the kind of thing I've been looking for." She grabbed her phone and started searching for local stables right then and there. It was like I'd finally cracked the code. For the first time in weeks, she looked genuinely excited about a hobby. I'll admit, it felt good to have been the one to suggest it. Within a day, she'd found a nearby stable that offered beginner lessons. She showed me the website, scrolling through photos of the horses and the facilities. She was already imagining herself riding through fields, wind in her hair. I could see it in her face. "I'm calling them tomorrow," she said decisively. True to her word, the next morning, she called the stable. I could hear snippets of the conversation from the other room. She was asking all kinds of questions. "What kind of horses do you have? How long are the lessons? What should I wear?" She sounded like a kid on Christmas morning. When she hung up, she came to find me. "I have a consultation scheduled for next week," she announced. "They're going to show me around and help me get started." In the days leading up to the consultation, she couldn't stop talking about it. Every spare moment, she was on her phone, looking up riding outfits, watching videos of equestrian tips, and reading articles about horse care. She even ordered a pair of riding boots online, saying she wanted to be prepared. It was like a switch had flipped. This wasn't just another hobby, it felt like she was finally onto something real. She started telling everyone about it. When her friends called, the first thing she'd say was, "Guess what? I'm taking up horseback riding." Her enthusiasm was contagious. Even her coworkers, the same ones she'd been comparing herself to, were impressed. One of them apparently said, "Wow, that's so cool. I've always wanted to try that." Hearing that only fueled her excitement. The night before her consultation, she couldn't sit still. She kept going over her list of questions, rehearsing what she wanted to say. I teased her a little about it, saying she was acting like she was preparing for a job interview. She just laughed and said, "This is important. I want to make a good impression." When the day finally came, she was up early, dressed in her new boots and a crisp button-up shirt she'd picked out specifically for the occasion. She spent over an hour at the stable, meeting the trainers and getting a feel for the place. By the time she came home, she was practically glowing. "It's perfect," she told me. "The horses are beautiful, the trainers are so nice, and they said I can start lessons next week." She didn't stop there. She immediately called her best friend to share the news, then sent a group text to her coworkers. I've never seen her so excited about anything before. This time, it felt different. The day of my wife's first horseback riding lesson started with a buzz of excitement. She woke up early, laid out her riding boots and neatly folded clothes, and double-checked the directions to the stable at least twice. I could see the anticipation in the way she moved around the house, her energy spilling over into everything she did. When she finally left, she had a look of determination on her face, the kind you don't often see outside of major life events. I'll admit, I was curious to see how this would play out. When she came back a few hours later, the excitement had only grown. She burst through the door, her face glowing, and immediately started talking. "It was amazing," she exclaimed, practically skipping into the living room. She launched into a detailed play-by-play of the lesson, the names of the trainers, the feel of the horse beneath her, how she'd managed to get the horse to trot for the first time. I sat back and let her talk, nodding occasionally and throwing in a "that's great" or "sounds fun" when appropriate. She didn't seem to notice whether I was fully engaged or not, she was too busy reliving the experience out loud. Over the next few days, she couldn't stop talking about it. Whenever she saw a friend or coworker, the first thing out of her mouth was about her horseback riding lesson. "Did you know horses can sense your mood?" she'd say, or, "It's all about balance, I'm learning so much." Even her coworkers, who she'd once envied for their hobbies, seemed genuinely impressed. She told me they were all supportive, asking questions and encouraging her to keep it up. One of them apparently joked, "We'll have to call you the horse whisperer soon." She loved it. As the weeks went on, her enthusiasm didn't waver. Every Saturday morning, she'd head to the stable for her lesson, and every Saturday afternoon, she'd come home brimming with new stories. One week, she learned how to groom the horses and couldn't stop talking about how therapeutic it was. "There's something so calming about brushing their coats," she said. "It's like they're letting you into their world." Another week, she mastered a new riding technique and spent the evening explaining the finer points of posture and control to me, complete with hand gestures and miming the motions of holding reins. She didn't just talk about it, she started incorporating it into other parts of her life. She bought a couple of books on horseback riding and spent evenings reading up on equestrian techniques and horse care. I'd catch her watching videos online, studying how professional riders moved in sync with their horses. It wasn't just a hobby anymore, it was becoming a part of her identity. She even started using phrases like, "when I'm at the stable," as if she'd been doing it for years. One day, she came home with a bag of carrots and apples. When I asked what they were for, she grinned and said, "The horses, of course. It's nice to give them a treat after a lesson." She told me how the trainers had explained the importance of bonding with the animals, and she wanted to do her part. It was a small gesture, but it showed how invested she was becoming. She also started bringing little pieces of her new world into our home. One evening, she set up a makeshift saddle stand in the corner of the living room, using it to practice adjusting straps and learning how to mount properly. "The trainers say you can never practice too much," she explained when I raised an eyebrow. Another time, she brought home a magazine about equestrian sports and left it on the coffee table, flipping through it during commercials while we watched TV. Even her phone was full of horseback riding content. She'd show me videos of riders performing intricate routines or pictures of beautiful horses she'd found online. She even started following a couple of professional riders on social media, pointing out their tips and tricks as if she were studying for an exam. It was clear this wasn't just a passing phase. By the end of the first month, she was fully immersed in the world of horseback riding. She'd tell anyone who would listen about her lessons, the horses she'd met, and the skills she was learning. One evening, she even spent an hour on the phone with a friend, giving an enthusiastic rundown of everything she'd experienced so far. "You have to try it," I overheard her saying. "It's like nothing else. You feel so free." It was the happiest I'd seen her in a long time. One evening, I was sitting at home, scrolling through my phone, when my wife sent me a message out of the blue. "I've got something to tell you when I get home," she wrote. "You won't believe it." Now, she's not usually one for cryptic messages, so this immediately caught my attention. I figured it had something to do with her riding lessons or maybe one of her coworkers. I replied with a simple, "All right, I'm listening," and left it at that. No point in prying too much over text when she'd clearly decided to make it an in-person conversation. When she got home later that night, she came in with a mischievous grin on her face. "All right," she said, kicking off her shoes, "you're not going to believe what happened today." I leaned back in my chair, ready for whatever story she had lined up. It was rare to see her this amused about something, so I knew it had to be good. She started off by telling me about her meetup with one of her closest friends. They'd gone to their usual spot for coffee and were catching up about everything from work to hobbies. At some point, her friend brought up something completely unexpected. She said she'd ordered something online that was, let's just say, unusual. My wife began, clearly enjoying the build-up. I raised an eyebrow, curious but not entirely sure where this was going. "Unusual how?" I asked. She laughed and said, "Just wait. You're going to love this." Apparently, her friend had recently purchased what she described as a novelty item, a dildo modeled after a horse's anatomy. The sheer absurdity of it had my wife's friend in stitches, and now my wife was struggling to get through the story without laughing herself. She showed me a picture of it, she said, shaking her head. It was massive. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. I couldn't help but chuckle at this point. Why on earth would someone even make something like that? I asked, half joking. That's exactly what I said, my wife replied, throwing her hands up. And you know what she told me? She said it's just for fun, like a joke. But honestly, I can't imagine anyone actually using it. She paused, her expression half amused and half incredulous. What do you think? She asked, clearly expecting some sort of reaction from me. I couldn't help but laugh out loud at the absurdity of the whole situation. I think your friend has a very unique sense of humor, I said, shaking my head. That's definitely not something you hear about every day. My wife continued, still amused by the whole thing. She said she ordered it just to see my reaction. Can you believe that? I told her she's insane, but honestly, it's kind of hilarious. She went on to describe her friend's reasoning in more detail, which mostly boiled down to a mix of curiosity and wanting a good laugh. I decided to throw in a joke of my own. Well, at least she's not bringing it to the stables, I said with a smirk. My wife burst out laughing, shaking her head. You're terrible, she said, still giggling. But I could tell she appreciated the humor. By the end of the conversation, we were both laughing at the sheer absurdity of the situation. It was one of those moments where you can't quite believe what you're hearing, but you're too entertained to question it. That's wild, I said finally. People come up with the craziest things. She nodded in agreement, still smiling. It's definitely one for the books. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a shift in my wife's behavior. She'd always been eager to share every detail about her horseback riding lessons, from the horses she worked with to the new techniques she was learning. But now, she seemed more reserved. She'd come home later than usual, claiming the lessons were running longer or that she'd stayed back to help out. When I asked her how things were going, her answers were vague, almost dismissive. It's fine, she'd say, changing the subject quickly. It was unlike her, and it didn't sit right with me. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just tired or stressed. But the more it happened, the more suspicious it seemed. She'd leave the house in a rush, barely saying goodbye, and return hours later looking distracted. When I asked if something was wrong, she'd shake her head and give me a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't just the lateness that bothered me, it was the way she seemed to be avoiding talking about the stable altogether. One evening, as she walked in the door later than usual, I decided to press her a bit. You've been spending a lot of time at the stable lately, I said. Everything all right? She hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yeah, everything's fine, she replied, her tone too casual. Then she added, the trainers just needed some extra help with the horses. Something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing that excuse in advance. The thought started to creep into my mind, maybe there was more going on than she was letting on. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the secrecy and the change in her demeanor made it hard not to. The idea that she might be seeing someone else began to take hold. I hated even considering it, but the inconsistencies in her stories left me with little else to go on. I decided to find out for myself what was really happening. The next evening, I waited until she left for the stable before grabbing my keys and heading out after her. I kept a safe distance, not wanting her to notice me following. When she turned into the stable's driveway, I parked a bit further down the road and walked the rest of the way. The place was quiet, the faint sounds of horses shuffling in their stalls carrying through the cool evening air. I stayed in the shadows, feeling a bit ridiculous but determined to get to the bottom of this. I peered into the stable through a side window, scanning the rows of stalls. At first, everything seemed normal. A few horses stood calmly in their enclosures, the faint smell of hay and leather wafting through the air. Then, I spotted her at the far end of the stable. She was in one of the stalls with a horse, and something about the way she was moving caught my attention. My stomach tightened as I realized what I was seeing. She was completely naked, her body pressed against the horse in a way that made my mind reel. It was so bizarre, so far removed from anything I could have imagined, that for a moment, I just stood there, unable to process it. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of mistake, that I wasn't really seeing what I thought I was. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became. My shock quickly turned to anger. I pushed the stable door open and stepped inside, my footsteps echoing against the wooden walls. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice louder than I intended. She froze, her eyes wide with fear as she turned to look at me. "This isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice trembling. But there was no explaining away what I'd just seen. "Not what it looks like," I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You're telling me this isn't exactly what it looks like?" She started to say something, but I didn't wait to hear it. The image of her in that stall was burned into my mind, and I couldn't stand to be there another second. I turned and walked out, my footsteps heavy against the stable floor. By the time I reached my car, my mind was racing, and my hands were shaking. I didn't know what to think, let alone what to do next. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. Whatever explanation she might have had, it was too late. The damage was done, and I couldn't unsee what I'd just witnessed. As I drove away, the only thing I could focus on was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that stable. When I got home that night, I was seething. The entire drive back, my mind was a whirlwind of disbelief and anger. What I'd seen at the stable was beyond anything I could have ever imagined, and the sheer absurdity of it only fueled my rage. I didn't want to think, didn't want to process, I just wanted to act. As soon as I stepped through the door, I went straight to the bedroom and started pulling her things out of the closet. One by one, I threw them into a pile on the floor, the sound of hangers clattering against the wood barely registering in my ears. Her shoes, her clothes, her bags, everything she'd brought into our home now felt like an invasion, a reminder of what she'd done. I grabbed a suitcase and started shoving her belongings into it, not caring if anything got wrinkled or damaged. The anger coursing through me didn't leave room for care or consideration. This wasn't just about what I'd seen, it was about the betrayal, the absolute insanity of her actions, and the humiliation I felt knowing that this was the person I'd chosen to share my life with. As I was in the middle of clearing out her dresser, I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. My jaw tightened. Of course she'd followed me home, there was no way she could have stayed at the stable after what had happened. I ignored the sound of her footsteps approaching the house, focusing instead on the task at hand. But when the front door opened and I heard her voice, I couldn't hold back any longer. "What the hell are you doing?" she shouted, stepping into the bedroom. Her eyes widened when she saw the mess I'd made, the piles of her belongings scattered across the floor. "What's going on?" I turned to face her, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "What does it look like I'm doing?" I snapped. "I'm getting rid of your stuff. You're not staying here another minute." She looked stunned, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words. Finally, she managed to say, "You're overreacting. You don't even understand what was happening back there." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I shot back, my voice rising. "I understand that you've completely lost your mind. Do you even hear yourself? Do you have any idea how insane this all is?" That seemed to snap something in her, and she squared her shoulders, her expression shifting to defiance. "I was doing it for us," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "I wanted to give us something special. You know how much I hate the idea of having children. But a little horse. A baby horse that we could raise together, It's perfect. It's everything I've ever wanted. For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to process the words coming out of her mouth. A baby horse. She actually thought this was a reasonable explanation, that this somehow justified everything. I let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking my head. You've completely lost it, I said, my voice cold. Do you even hear yourself right now? A baby horse. That's your grand plan. And you thought this was something I'd go along with? It's better than children, she insisted, her tone growing desperate. You know I've never wanted kids. But this could be something beautiful. Something that's ours. I couldn't take it anymore. The sheer absurdity of her words, the way she was standing there defending herself like any of this made sense, it was too much. How could you do this? I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. How could you betray me like this? You didn't just betray me, you betrayed everything we've built together. And for what? For this insane idea. For a horse. She took a step forward, reaching out as if to calm me down, but I stepped back, holding up a hand to stop her. Don't, I said sharply. Don't come near me. I can't even look at you right now. Her expression crumbled, but I didn't care. I couldn't let her manipulate me with tears or excuses. As far as I was concerned, there was no coming back from this. How could you trade me for a horse? I said, my voice low but full of contempt. Do you even realize how ridiculous that sounds? How disgusting it is. And with that, I turned back to the suitcase, refusing to look at her again. The divorce process was quick, but not without its fair share of tension. I filed the papers the very next day after kicking her out. There was no point in dragging things out, I'd seen enough to know there was no fixing what had been broken. She didn't contest the filing, though she sent a few angry messages accusing me of overreacting and not trying to understand her vision. I didn't bother responding to most of them. What was there to say? The damage was already done, and I wasn't about to entertain her delusions. The legal proceedings were straightforward. We didn't have kids, and our assets were simple enough to divide. I kept the house, which was a relief. The thought of leaving behind the home I'd worked hard to build, all because of her madness, was unbearable. She took her personal belongings, and that was that. The whole process took just a few weeks, but it felt like a lifetime. By the end of it, I was mentally drained but relieved to finally have her out of my life for good. I didn't hold back when it came to telling people what had happened. Friends, co-workers, even casual acquaintances, they all got the story. I wasn't doing it out of spite, at least, not entirely. I wanted people to understand why things had ended the way they did. And, frankly, I didn't want anyone thinking I was the one at fault. When I told them about the stable incident and her bizarre plan for little horses, their reactions ranged from shock to outright laughter. Some people didn't believe me at first, but I had no problem repeating the details until they did. The story spread quickly. It wasn't long before mutual friends and even people who barely knew her were talking about it. I heard from a friend that she'd been avoiding social gatherings because of the whispers and side glances. Some people might call that cruel, but I saw it as a consequence of her own actions. If you're going to do something as insane as what she did, you can't expect people to just shrug it off. About a month after the divorce was finalized, she showed up at my door unannounced. I wasn't expecting her, and the sight of her standing there, looking disheveled and angry, immediately put me on edge. What do you want? I asked, keeping my tone flat. She wasted no time getting to the point. Why are you telling people about what happened? She demanded. Do you have any idea what you've done to my life? Her voice was shaky, but there was an edge of fury in it. I told them the truth, I replied calmly. If you're embarrassed, maybe you should have thought about that before you did what you did. That set her off. She launched into a tirade, accusing me of ruining her reputation and making her a laughingstock. She even tried to guilt-trip me, saying that she'd been vulnerable and misunderstood. I let her rant for a while, arms crossed, waiting for her to run out of steam. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I said, "You brought this on yourself. Don't come here blaming me for the consequences of your actions." She didn't take that well. Her anger escalated, and she started pacing around my front porch, gesturing wildly and yelling loud enough for the neighbors to hear. At one point, she started accusing me of trying to sabotage her life on purpose, calling me vindictive and cruel. It was clear she was spiraling, and I knew I had to do something before the situation got even more out of hand. I stepped back into the house and called for an ambulance. When the dispatcher asked for the reason, I explained that my ex-wife was having a mental health crisis and needed immediate attention. I'd never done anything like this before, but I couldn't just stand by and let her continue to unravel in front of me. When the paramedics arrived, she tried to resist, yelling at them and at me, but they managed to calm her down enough to get her into the ambulance. As they drove away, I stood on the porch, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was a fitting end to a chapter of my life that had gone so far off the rails. I didn't know what would happen to her next, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't be my problem anymore.